not comfortable doing it. Scott convinced me, and the next quarter is going to be just the same error, but the opposite direction. The two will wipe out each other, and everything will be fine, but you need to produce an entry this quarter to fix the problem that I know is there.
I first became aware of the accounting fraud case of Swier Hygiene recently while studying for my CPA continuing education class on quality of earnings. What struck me the most about the case is how similar it was to the 1999 case of WorldCom fraud.
Scott D. Sullivan and David F. Myers were charged with 7 counts of securities fraud.
So I wanted to make this video to talk to you about the similarities between the two cases, WorldCom in 1999 and Swier Hygiene in 2011, to talk about the similarities but then the difference in the outcome. There's a big difference in the outcome for the controller, and I care about the controller because I'm the financial controller. I care about the outcome for the controller. In WorldCom, the controller came out of the other side of the trial as a criminal, right? While with Swier Hygiene, as you'll see here in a minute, the controller came out on the other end as the hero. So let's talk about the similarities and differences in these two cases. And you should care about this if you're someone who is in accounting or finance, or quite frankly, anyone who has any kind of influence over the production of the financial statements, even if you're a business owner, because the investors have or put a certain amount of trust in you, so you have a responsibility of professional ethical behavior. And so this is the topic of this video today. Stick around. Before we jump into this topic, and as you watch this video, if you find it helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, as it helps the almighty YouTube algorithm put this video in front of more people so that they can learn from it as well. Also, if you want to learn more from me, you can check out my online courses on various topics, including financial metrics or KPIs, creating a KPI dashboard, accounting interview skills, etc., etc. You could also chat directly with me and ask me your questions if you become a member on Patreon. Now, back to the video. All right, we'll begin the story by looking at WorldCom. We'll look at the accounting scandal there, and then we'll switch over to Swier Hygiene and see what happened there in 2011. And so we'll go back in time to 1999 when WorldCom was gearing up to report its Q4 earnings, right? So as a public company, you have to report your earnings quarterly, right? And usually you have about 30 days to report your earnings. So the company was getting ready to report its earnings, and the controller at the time, David Myers, printed out the financial statements and went into the office of the CFO, showing him the financial statements. And then the CFO looked at it and looked at the margin and said immediately, this has to be a mistake. Something is wrong with these financials. These margins cannot be the margins. We have given the analyst, the Wall Street analyst, a vastly different number for the margin. So there must be something wrong here. Take back these financials and rework it and come back to me.
It's exact words, that we had screwed up, that we had made a mistake, and to take the financial statements, he wasn't even going to keep them. They were wrong. So, I knew they weren't, but I didn't, at that point in time, didn't know enough facts about it to be able to tell him that he was wrong. So I took the financial statements back. We reworked the entire quarter and came back to basically the same number.
So David Myers, the controller at the time, took the financial statements back and went back to his team and looked at it, kind of reworked it again, and came back with the same number, right? So he got the same number. He went back to the CFO, I think his name was Sullivan, and he said, hey, Sullivan, here are the financials, the same numbers. So the CFO looked at it and said, something must be wrong here again. And he said, there is a journal entry that you have to book to improve these margins.
So when I took those back to Scott, again, his response was, this is so far off where we had told the public market we're going to be. We can't do this. There must be a mistake. There has to be a mistake.
Now, the whole reason why the CFO is coming up with an entry to book is because he's under a certain pressure from Wall Street, because he had guided Wall Street to a certain margin for the quarter, while now the actual margin is coming in much lower. So this is going to be a big problem for the stock price. So he's under a certain pressure to meet the expectation that he had guided Wall Street to, and that's why he's coming up with a journal entry that he's now telling the controller to book. Now, the controller is closer to the numbers, right? He knows that he understands this journal entry is not correct. But the two problems that we're having here is that the controller, he has two pressures. One is that he has a certain deadline to meet. Now, he had gone back and reworked the numbers and wasted tons of time. He has only 30 days to report earnings, so he has a time pressure, right? So the first pressure is a time pressure to meet the deadline to report the quarterly earnings. Now, the second pressure that the controller is under is that he has a certain respect. He respects the intelligence of the CFO, and he holds him in high regard, and he's thinking, if this CFO knows something that I don't know, then maybe he's right? But the ethical standard here, the controller has a responsibility to understand what he's booking, right? So the CFO is handing him an entry, he doesn't understand it, it's improving the margin, but he doesn't get it. So he has, as we're going to talk about here in a minute, there are 5 ethical standards for the accountant. He's supposed to understand what this journal entry is trying to do. So David Myers, the controller, expresses his discomfort with that journal entry to the CFO. And the CFO, to calm him down, he said, listen, this is a reserve. We're going to book it now because we have a tight deadline to report. Let's book it. And then after the quarter, after we report the earnings, we'll go back and investigate and find the real mistakes that you couldn't find. We're going to release that reserve and book the actual, and we'll be fine. It's going to wash itself out, right?
So Scott actually tells me, I know the numbers are wrong. I know what they should be. We need to book an entry to get where I know we should be, and then we'll figure out what the error is at the end of the quarter. And the next quarter is going to be just the same error, but the opposite direction. The two will wipe out each other, and everything will be fine. But you need to produce an entry this quarter to fix the problem that I know is there.
So now, because also of the tight deadline that the controller is under, he agreed to it reluctantly, right? And the way that David Myers put it in an interview, I'm going to leave a link down below to the very interesting interview that David Myers gave. He felt at the moment that he wasn't defrauding anyone, that this is not fraud, it's not criminal. What he called it is that it wasn't clean accounting, right? He called it aggressive accounting. So he looked at it as something that is not clean, and this is now a very fine line between unclean accounting, criminal and fraudulent activity, right? And we'll see later how this is going to play out.
Not comfortable doing it, but again, we're not doing anything that is considered criminal or fraudulent. It's just not good accounting.
So David Myers, the controller, takes the entry from the CFO and goes back to his team and they book it and they report earnings, right? So now they report earnings on time, they met expectations and everything was great. But now we are in the following quarter and he's supposed to go back and investigate for the mistake that the CFO had claimed had happened, right? So that they can fix it, they can release the reserve, book the actual mistake, and then everybody will be happy, right? So they're digging back in the records and they can't find any mistakes that the CFO had claimed that they have made, right? So now the end of that following quarter is coming around and the same thing is happening again, where we have a certain pressure to meet the expectations of investors, pressures for the deadline to report financials, and the same thing is happening again now. So we have to report, now David Myers is booking the same bogus entry again in the following quarter. So he does that once, twice, and 3 times because he's under the same pressures from the CFO to meet the deadline and to meet the numbers that they give to Wall Street. And now what happens after this, how all of this gets uncovered, is that the internal auditor of the company is conducting the regular internal audit of the financials, and they find the journal entry that is bogus, that has no support, no backup. They go to David Myers, the controller, they say, where is the support for this journal entry? Of course, he points the finger at the CFO. The CFO points the finger back at him, and there's no support for the journal entry. Then the internal auditor raises up the concern to the audit committee, and then that's how the whole thing gets unraveled, and the company files for bankruptcy. Then later on, the CEO gets indicted, as well as the CFO and the controller gets the least amount of the jail sentence. He gets about 1 year and 1 day, I think. And then the CFO gets about 5 years. The CEO gets about 25 years in jail. So this is the jail sentence after the fraud was uncovered. Now let's talk about the other accounting fraud case with Swisher Hygiene and the amazing response from the controller and how he handled the situation to come out in the other end as a hero, compared to what happened with WorldCom, where the controller came out as a criminal and served a jail sentence. So with Swier Hygiene, this is a company in the cleaning product industry. So they make cleaning products. And in 2011, they were facing very similar expectations and pressures from Wall Street to meet a certain forecast for the margin. So the CFO tells the controller and the company that he has to book a journal entry to capitalize some of the operating expenses and put it on the balance sheet, right? So the controller, when he looks at the journal entry proposal from the CFO, looks at it, obviously the controller is closer to the numbers than the CFO. He looks at it and he says, I have to run this by the auditors, and the auditors were BDO at the time. So he said, I have to run this entry by the auditors. So the CFO's response, and I think it was in an email, he said, you don't run it by the auditors, you run it by me. I'm the CFO. What does the controller do as a response to that? He's being pressured by the CFO to book a journal entry that has no basis, no justification, right? He goes straight to the audit committee and he says, the CFO is pressuring me to book a journal entry that has no basis, no support, and no justification, and therefore I am reporting this to you, right? At the same time, the CFO had moved to fire him, so he got fired, he lost his job, but he kept much more than that, which is his reputation, right? So he came out of this story in all these financial reports and all these articles as the hero to save the day, while in the other case we talked about with WorldCom, the controller, although he had no criminal intent, he didn't go out of his way to defraud investors, but he fell in the slippery slope of being pressured by someone else that he respects to book something he doesn't support, right? So this is the big difference here, is the Swisher controller stood his ground and kept to the ethical standard that he is supposed to adhere to. So in recap to this video, if you are someone who has some control over the production of financial statements, so maybe you work in the accounting department of a company, maybe you're the controller or CFO, or maybe you are a small company business owner who produces the financial statements themselves, there is a certain element of trust that investors and stakeholders has put in you. So if you find yourself in a situation of doubt, of not knowing how to treat a certain transaction or a certain booking to the financial statements, it's always going to be better for you and everyone else if you seek the guidance of someone else that you trust, who's an expert in the field. So don't ever think that you have to walk it alone and you have to think about it alone. Find someone else that you trust and ask their guidance for the matter at hand. This is what I get out of these two stories and the outcome of what happened with WorldCom Controller and the Swier Hygiene Controller.